It's not uncommon for us to be required to make some changes or modifications to the VMs as they appear inside of vCenter. So in this nugget, I'd like to share with you some details and some demonstrations on how we can do exactly that, and provide some additional confidence if you ever do need to unregister or re-register a virtual machine with vCenter. When making a change to a production environment, there's always that moment when you make the change where you just hope that it goes well. And in helping to reinforce our confidence when we're making changes regarding VMs that are listed inside of vCenter, I want to first share with you some details about how that all works, and then walk you through some examples in the hands-on lab. So let's say, for example, that we've been given the requirement to make our virtual machines look like this inside of vSphere. So we have the vCenter server appliance. Currently that's running on ESXi1 right here. And let's imagine that we've been given the requirements to have these VM names, VM1, 2, 3, 4, running on these ESXi hosts, and having the files, the folders if you will, for those VMs located on these respective data stores. Now in our current inventory, the listing of VMs that we currently have to work with, we also have a VM-5. And because in this list it's not there, we can go ahead and delete that. Now the process of deletion is pretty simple. We'd right click on the VM, say delete, and that would remove the VM from the inventory inside of vCenter. It would also remove the folder on the respective data store. And after it's done, it's gone. That VM is over. Now, short of deleting a virtual machine completely, we also have the option of removing a virtual machine. And what the remove option does is simply removes the VM. Big shock there. It removes the VM from the vCenter inventory. However, it doesn't mess with the files. So if we go to the data store where that folder and the files for that VM are kept, they are still there. So if we wanted to, we could go back to the data store where that folder is. We could right click on the configuration file for the VM, which is the .vmx file, and we could add it back into, we could re-register it with vCenter. And as we add a virtual machine back in, the wizard that comes up is going to ask us some questions. One of those questions is going to be, which ESXi host would you like to use as the compute resource for this VM? Now it won't ask us, which data store do you want to use? And that's because we're already inside of a folder in a data store. It's going to use the existing data store that we're re-registering from. And then once we're done, poof, that VM will show back up in the inventory inside of vCenter. Now, one other aspect that I want to talk about is renaming a virtual machine, which, on the surface is really easy to do. You simply right-click on the VM. From the drop-down, you select Rename, and then you type in the new name of that virtual machine. You click on the button to confirm it, and you're done. However, what happens behind the scenes, if we had a VM called, for example, Linux-VM1. Behind the scenes, originally, in the data store, we're going to have a folder called Linux-VM1, if that was the VM name. And when we rename a VM in vCenter, all we're really doing is we're renaming the label for that VM. But behind the scenes, it's still going to have the old folder name. It doesn't rename the folder. So if we rename the VM to VM-1, that would be the name of the VM, but the folder would still be this Linux-VM1. And a common response to that by administrators is, I can't stand that. I want the actual folder name to match the VM name. And there's a simple solution to correcting that problem. And that solution is to go ahead and migrate. So if we have a new VM name and then we migrate the VM over to a different data store, as part of that migration process, the new folder it creates will match the VM name. And then the next question might be, well, what if we want it on the original data store? Well, you migrate it twice. You could migrate it over to another data store and then back. And that would also allow that VM to have a matching folder name. So for our lab, let's imagine we've been given this requirement of having these virtual machines on these ESXi hosts with these respective data stores. And for this one right here, for the vCenter server appliance, we are going to leave that alone. It is a resource greedy virtual machine with lots of hard drives, and because it's driving vCenter, which we're using for the administration of our vSphere environment, we're going to go ahead and leave it alone so it can just continue to operate. We don't want to disrupt or even potentially disrupt those services even for a moment. So we'll focus our attention on these 4 VMs, VMs 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if we have any additional VMs in our topology, we can go ahead and simply delete those completely so they're no longer present. So on our Windows management computer, let's go ahead and double click on the icon right here for the vSphere web client. Now because we're using self-signed certificates on the vCenter server appliance, if this message ever comes up out, hey, I don't trust the certificate, we can just click on Advanced. This is in Chrome. and then scroll down and click on Proceed to vcsa.nuggetlab.com. So that is very likely to not pop up every time, but when it does, we know how to proceed through it just like we did originally when we first used Chrome to connect to the vCenter server appliance in an earlier nugget in this course. So we'll supply our username and password for the lab environment and click Login. Here in the vSphere web client, let's go ahead and click on the tab for VMs and Templates right here. And from here, let's take a look at VM-5 by clicking on it. So here on VM-5 and on the Summary tab for that VM, over here in the Related Objects, we can see the host that's supporting that VM is currently ESXi3, or at least will be when that VM is turned on, and it's using the iSCSI data store. So if we wanted to go over to that specific data store, we could click on it here, or we could click on the data stores in reference to the VM-5 machine. We could go ahead and click on Browse Files regarding the iSCSI data store. So let's go ahead and click on Browse Files, and then subsequently let's click on VM5, the VM5 folder, and there's the files for that virtual machine. So if we removed this virtual machine from inventory from a vCenter perspective, it would leave the files here in this folder. So let's go back to the VMs and Templates tab, and then let's right click on VM5. And also while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and maximize Chrome to full screen. And then let's right click on VM5, and from the drop down we're going to select Remove from Inventory. Now, delete from disk, that's a serious issue. That's going to remove it from inventory and delete the folder, but remove from inventory simply removes it from the inventory inside of vCenter. So we're going to click on Remove from Inventory. We'll click on Yes to the confirmation message. And because that object no longer exists, let's go ahead and click on some other object, for example, the VMs folder. And now let's go back to the iSCSI data store just to verify that the folder and the files are still there. So let's click on the Storage tab right here. It takes us back to where we were, which is the iSCSI data store, and also to the Files tab. And here in the list, we can see VM5, the folder still exists. And also, if we wanted to be sure that we're looking at the latest and greatest information, we could use this refresh icon regarding the data store right over here. So let's do that. We'll click on Refresh. And sure enough, the VM5 folder is still there. If we click on that, there's our files. And if we want to re-register this and put it back in the inventory for vCenter, we can simply right-click on the .vmx file, and then from the drop-down, select Register VM. So we'll click on Register VM. The wizard's asking us where would you like to place this virtual machine. So we'll select the VMs folder inside the Las Vegas Data Center and click Next. It's asking us which host do we want to run this on. So for this demo, we'll choose an ESXi host. I'm going to choose ESXi3, and with that selected, click Next. Here's a summary, and we'll click on Finish. We'll go ahead and click on Recent Tasks just to verify that that is done. Fantastic. So the registration is done. So now let's go back to VMs and Templates by clicking on that tab. And I'm also going to go ahead and minimize the recent tasks. And you'll notice once again we have VM5 right here. And if we go back to the Summary tab for VM5, it'll show us the VM hardware here and the related objects. And we can collapse and expand those as needed depending on what we want to look at. Now, because VM5 is not in our list, we're going to go ahead and completely delete it from vSphere. So to do that, back in the vSphere web client, we would right-click on that virtual machine that we want to get rid of, and from the drop-down list, we would select Delete from Disk, which is a fairly permanent operation. If we want this VM back after we delete it, we have to restore from some type of backup system, presuming that we backed up that VM previously. So we're going to click on Delete from Disk. It's asking us to confirm the deletion, and we'll click on Yes. So now that it's gone, let's go back to our Storage tab, and we'll select the iSCSI data store. We're on the Files tab regarding the iSCSI data store, and even though here it shows VM5 because that's where we left it, let's click on a refresh right over here so we can have a updated view of that data store and its files. And you'll notice now that the folder for VM5 is completely gone. Next, let's take a look at the task of renaming a virtual machine. So currently we have a goal, this is our task list here, of having a VM called VM-1. Currently we've got a VM with a slightly different name. So let's go ahead and rename a virtual machine, and we can also verify at the same time that the folder name in the data store for that VM does not change. So back in the vSphere web client, let's go once again to VMs and Templates, and let's focus on Linux-VM1. So we'll click on Linux-VM1 here inside the VMs folder. So here for Linux-VM1 on the Summary tab, over here in related objects, we can see that it's on the NFS data store. We can also click on data stores right here regarding Linux-VM1, and it would also show us the data store that it's on. So if we click on browse files regarding that data store, here we have 3 folders for VM1, 2, and 3. If we click on Linux-VM1, there's all the files for Linux-VM1. So if we rename the virtual machine, and we can do so by going back to VMs and templates, and then right-clicking on Linux-VM1, and from the drop-down, simply select rename, and then give it the name we want. So based on our plan, we're going to call this VM-1, and click OK. If we look at recent tasks, it shows that that has completed. Fantastic. And if we go back to the data store for VM1, and we can do that right here on VM1 with the Data Stores tab selected, and simply with NFS Data Store highlighted, click on Browse Files. And then let's go ahead and click on Refresh right here for the Data Store to make sure we're looking at the latest and greatest information. You'll notice that the folder is still named Linux-VM1. So the folder doesn't change by default just because we renamed a VM in the inventory of vCenter. So if we want the folder name for the VM files to match the VM name, we can simply do a migration to solve that. So if we want to migrate, in fact, let's take a look at our plan for a moment. So our plan regarding VM1 is to have the host ESXi2 be the compute resource and use iSCSI as the data store. So currently we're on NFS. So if we simply migrate the files for the VM to a different data store, in this case iSCSI, the new folder that will be created on the iSCSI data store will match the VM name. So back in the vSphere web client, let's go back once again to the VMs and Templates tab. And with VM1 selected, we'll click on the Summary tab. And based on our plan, we need to migrate not only the files to a iSCSI data store, but we also need to migrate to a different compute resource, specifically ESXi-2. So that's simple to do. We've done that previously in our nugget on vMotion. We'll right-click on VM1. And from the Actions menu, we'll go ahead and click on Migrate. And before we do the migration, what's the biggest difference? Do you remember what is the big difference between a migration of either the compute resource or the storage versus a vMotion of the compute resource or a storage vMotion regarding the data store? Do you recall the difference? And if you're thinking, Keith, if the VM is running and we do the migration, that's when it's referred to as vMotion. If the machine is powered off, it's simply a migration. And if that's what you thought, you are right on the money. Great job. So let's select the radio button for change both the compute resource and storage. And we'll start off by choosing the compute resource, the ESXi host, and then following that, we'll specify which data store we want to use. So with that third radio button selected, we'll click on Next. To select the compute resource, we'll go ahead and expand everything and select ESXi-2 based on our plan. And with ESXi-2 selected, we'll click Next. Next, we're going to choose the data store, and we want to move this over to iSCSI. So we'll select iSCSI, and for the format, I'm going to go ahead and from the drop-down select Thin Provision. And with Thin Provisioning and the iSCSI data store selected, we'll click on Next. Currently, that VM is on a VM port group called new-VM network, and we are also going to place it on another VM port group with the exact same name. And that's because on our standard switches across all 3 ESXi hosts, we have a VM port group named new-VM_network on all 3. So ESXi2 says, no problem, I can put them on that port group. So we'll click on Next. Here's the summary, and we'll click on Finish. Now, while that's cooking, we have a couple more VMs to rename. We have Linux-VM2, which should be VM-2, and Linux-VM3, which will be renamed to VM-3. So to rename those, we'll simply right-click, and we'll start with Linux-VM2. So we'll right-click on Linux-VM2. From the drop-down, we'll go ahead and select Rename, and we'll simply rename this to VM-2, and click on OK. So with VM-2 selected, and on the Summary tab for VM2, here it's showing us that the host is ESXi2, which is great based on our plan, and it's also using the NFS data store, which is also great based on our plan. Now, the challenge is that it's going to have the old VM name regarding the folder on the NFS data store. So if we wanted to correct that, we could migrate to a different data store and then back to the NFS data store, and both of those migrations would include targeting a new folder that matched the VM name. If we're okay with a different folder name versus the VM name, so actually I'm okay with that for this VM. So let's go on to VM number 3, because it needs to be renamed as well. So we'll click on Linux-VM3, and on the Summary tab for Linux-VM3, It currently is on ESXi2. We want it to be on ESXi3. So we'll want to change that. And regarding the data store, based on our plan, we want that one on the NFS data store. So that currently is good to go regarding the files. So we need to do two things. We need to rename the VM, and we also need to do a change of the compute resource. So we'll right click on Linux-VM3. From the dropdown, we'll click on rename. We'll change the name to VM-3. Click OK. So we also need to change the host that's supporting VM3. So we'll right click on VM3. And from the drop-down, select Migrate. We'll choose this top radio button, change compute resource only, click on Next. We're going to select ESXi3 as our target, click on Next. We'll leave this virtual machine on the same VM port group that it was, click on Next, and click on Finish to make that new assignment. And then back at VM3 on the summary page, and a refresh if we need to manually do that, is now showing us that the host that's going to support this VM is ESXi3. And for VM4, let's go ahead and just click on VM4 to make sure it is in line with our plan. So with VM-4 selected and on the Summary tab, we want it to run on ESXi3, and we want it to be on the iSCSI data store, which it is already, so we don't need to change anything else about VM4. Now, what we can also do is let's verify that our migration for VM1 regarding the data store, let's verify that that's done. So if we click on Recent Tasks, it doesn't show it as still going, so that's great. So if we click on VM-1, here in the Summary tab, it shows that the data store is iSCSI data store. Let's go ahead and click on iSCSI data store. And I just want to verify that the folder on the iSCSI data store for VM-1 matches the name, which it should because we did the migration. So here on the iSCSI data store on the Files tab, if we click on VM1, there's all of our files for the virtual machine called VM1. Looks like we're good to go. So in this demonstration nugget, which is preparatory for you doing the hands-on practice in the labs that we provide, we've removed a virtual machine from the inventory inside of vCenter. We've added it back in using the .vmx file on the data store. We've completely deleted both the inventory object and the folder for the VM's files. And we've also renamed some virtual machines. And if you want the folder to match the name of the VM, we've also demonstrated how we can do a migration for that VM to a different data store, which will cause the new folder to match the new VM name. So my friend, now is your time to go ahead and practice with the hands-on labs, have some fun with that, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.